The Other Death, 1948. I have mislaid the letter, but a couple of years or so ago, Gannon wrote me from his ranch up in Gualeguaychú, saying he would send me a translation, perhaps the very first into Spanish, of Ralph Waldo Emerson's poem, The Past, and adding in a P.S. that Don Pedro Damián, whom I might recall, had died of a lung ailment a few nights earlier. The man, Gannon went on, wasted by fever, had in his delirium relived the long ordeal of the Battle of Masogère. It seemed to me there was nothing unreasonable or out of the ordinary about this news, since Don Pedro, when he was 19 or 20, had been a follower of the banners of Aparicio Saravia. Pedro Damián had been working as a hand up north on a ranch in Rio Negro, or Paysandú, when the 1904 revolution broke out. Although he was from Gualeguaychú, in the province of Entre Rios, he went along with his friends, and, being as cocky and ignorant as they were, joined the rebel army. He fought in one or two skirmishes, and in the final battle. Returned home in 1905, Damián, with a kind of humble stubbornness, once more took up his work as a cowhand. For all I know, he never left his native province again. He spent his last 30 years living in a small, lonely cabin 8 or 10 miles from Nyankay. It was in that out-of-the-way place that I spoke with him one evening, that I tried to speak with him one evening, back around 1942. He was a man of few words and not very bright. Masogère, it turned out, was the whole of his personal history, and so I was not surprised to find out that he had lived the sound and fury of that battle over again at the hour of his death. When I knew I would never see Damián another time, I wanted to remember him, but so poor is my memory for faces that all I could recall was the snapshot Gannon had taken of him. Now, there is nothing unusual in this fact, considering that I saw the man only once at the beginning of 1942, but had looked at his picture many times. Gannon sent me the photograph, and it, too, has been misplaced. I think now that if I were to come across it, I would feel afraid. The second episode took place in Montevideo months later. Don Pedro's fever and his agony gave me the idea for a tale of fantasy based on the defeat at Masogère. Emir Rodriguez Monegal, to whom I had told the plot, wrote me an introduction to Colonel Dionisio Tabares, who had fought in that campaign. The colonel received me one evening after dinner. From a rocking chair out in the side yard, he recalled the old days with great feeling, but at the same time with a faulty sense of chronology. He spoke of ammunition that never reached him, and of reserves of horses that arrived worn out, of sleepy, dust-covered men weaving labyrinths of marches, of Saravia, who might have ridden into Montevideo, but who passed it by, because the gaucho has a fear of towns, of throats hacked from ear to ear, of a civil war that seemed to me less a military operation than the dream of a cattle thief or an outlaw. Names of battles kept coming up: Illescas, Tupambaé, Masogère. The colonel's pauses were so effective and his manners so vivid that I realized he had told and retold these same things many times before, and I feared that behind his words almost no true memories remained. When he stopped for a breath, I managed to get in Damián's name. Damián? Pedro Damián, said the colonel. He served with me, a little half-breed. I remember the boys used to call him Daimán, after the river. The colonel let out a burst of loud laughter, then cut it off all at once. I could not tell whether his discomfort was real or put on. In another voice, he stated that war, like women, served as a test of men, and that nobody knew who he really was until he had been under fire, A man might think himself a coward and actually be brave, and the other way round, too, as it happened to that poor Damian, who bragged his way in and out of saloons with his white ribbon marking him as a Blanco, and later on lost his nerve at Massager. In one exchange of gunfire with the regulars, he handled himself like a man, but then it was something else again when the two armies met face to face, and the artillery began pounding away, and every man felt as though there were 5,000 other men out there grouping to kill him. That poor kid. He'd spent his life on a farm dipping sheep, and then all of a sudden he gets himself dragged along and mixed up in the grim reality of war. For some absurd reason, Barbares's version of the story made me uncomfortable. I would have preferred things to have happened differently. Without being aware of it, I had made a kind of idol out of old Damian, a man I'd seen only once on a single evening many years earlier. Barbares's story destroyed everything. Suddenly the reasons for Damian's aloofness and his stubborn insistence on keeping to himself were clear to me. They had not sprung from modesty, but from shame. In vain I told myself that a man pursued by an act of cowardice is more complex and more interesting than one who is merely courageous. The gaucho Martin Fierro, I thought, is less memorable than Lord Jim or Razumov. Yes, but Damian as a gaucho should have been Martin Fierro, especially in the presence of Uruguayan gauchos. In what Barbares left unsaid, I felt his assumption, perhaps undeniable, that Uruguay is more primitive than Argentina and therefore physically braver. I remember we said goodbye to each other that night with a cordiality that was a bit marked. During the winter, the need of one or two details for my story, which somehow was slow in taking shape, sent me back to Colonel Barbares again. I found him with another man of his own age, a Dr. Juan Francisco Amaro from Paysandú, who had also fought in Sarabia's revolution. They spoke naturally of Massager. Amaro told a few anecdotes, then slowly added in the manner of someone who was thinking aloud, "We camped for the night at Santa Irene, I recall, and some of the men from around there joined us. Among them a French veterinarian who died the night before the battle, and a boy, a sheep shearer from Entre Rios. Pedro Damian was his name." I cut him off sharply. "Yes, I know," I said. "The Argentine who couldn't face the bullets." I stopped. The two of them were looking at me, puzzled. "You're mistaken, sir," Amaro said after a while. "Pedro Damian died as any man might wish to die. It was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The regular troops had dug themselves in on the top of a hill, and our men charged them with lances. Damian rode at the head, shouting, and a bullet struck him square in the chest. He stood up in his stirrups, finished his shout, and then rolled to the ground, where he lay under the horse's hooves. He was dead, and the whole last charge of Massager trampled over him. So fearless, and barely 20. He was speaking, doubtless, of another Damian, but something made me ask what it was the boy had shouted. "Filth," said the colonel. "That's what men shout in action." "Maybe," said Amaro, "but he also cried out, 'Long live Urquiza.'" We were silent. Finally the colonel murmured, "Not as if we were fighting at Massager, but at Carrancha, or India Muerta, 100 years ago." He added, genuinely bewildered, "I commanded those troops, and I could swear it's the first time I've ever heard of this Damian." We had no luck in getting the colonel to remember him. Back in Buenos Aires, the amazement that his forgetfulness produced in me repeated itself. Browsing through the 11 pleasurable volumes of Emerson's works in the basement of Mitchell's, the English bookstore, I met Patricio Gannon one afternoon. I asked him for his translation of the past. He told me that he had no translation of it in mind, and that besides, Spanish literature was so boring it made Emerson quite superfluous. I reminded him that he had promised me the translation in the same letter in which he had written to me of Damien's death. He asked me who was Damien. I told him in vain. With rising terror, I noticed that he was listening to me very strangely, and I took refuge in a literary discussion on the detractors of Emerson, a poet far more complex, far more skilled, and truly more extraordinary than the unfortunate Poe. I must put down some additional facts. In April, I had a letter from Colonel Dionisio Tabares. His mind was no longer vague, and now he remembered quite well the boy from Entre Rios who spearheaded the charge at Massoger and whom his men buried that night in a grave at the foot of the hill. In July, I passed through Gualeguaychú. I did not come across Damien's cabin, and nobody there seemed to remember him now. I wanted to question the foreman, Diego Abaroa, who saw Damien die, but Abaroa had passed away himself at the beginning of the winter. I tried to call to mind Damien's features. Months later, leafing through some old albums, I found that the dark face I had attempted to evoke really belonged to the famous tenor Tamberlik, playing the role of Othello. Now I move on to conjectures. The easiest, but at the same time the least satisfactory, assumes two Damiens, the coward who died in Entre Rios around 1946, and the man of courage who died at Massoger in 1904. But this falls apart in its inability to explain what are really the puzzles, the strange fluctuations of Colonel Tabares's memory, for one, and the general forgetfulness which in so short a time could blot out the image and even the name of the man who came back. I cannot accept, I do not want to accept, a simpler possibility, that of my having dreamed the first man. Stranger still is the supernatural conjecture thought up by Ulrike von Kühlmann. Pedro Damien, said Ulrike, was killed in the battle, and at the hour of his death asked God to carry him back to Entre Rios. God hesitated a moment before granting the request, but by then the man was already dead and had been seen by others to have fallen. God, who cannot unmake the past, but can affect its images, altered the image of Damien's violent death into one of falling into a faint. And so it was the boy's ghost that came back to his native province. Came back, but we must not forget that it did so as a ghost. It lived in isolation, without a woman and without friends. It loved and possessed everything, but from a distance, as from the other side of a mirror. Ultimately, it died, and its frail image just disappeared like water in water. Now, this conjecture is faulty, but it may have been responsible for pointing out to me the true one, the one I now believe to be true, which is at the same time simpler and more unprecedented. In a mysterious way, I discovered it in the treatise De Omnipotentia by Pier Damiani, after having been referred to him by two lines in Canto 21 of the Paradiso, in which the problem of Damiani's identity is brought up. In the 5th chapter of that treatise, Pier Damiani asserts, against Aristotle and against Fritigerius de Tours, that it is within God's power to make what once was into something that has never been. Reading those old theological discussions, I began to understand Don Pedro Damian's tragic story. This is my solution. Damian handled himself like a coward on the battlefield at Massager, and spent the rest of his life setting right that shameful weakness. He returned to Entre Rios. He never lifted a hand against another man. He never cut anyone up. He never sought fame as a man of courage. Instead, living out there in the hill country of Nyankay and struggling with the backwoods and with wild cattle, he made himself tough, hard. Probably without realizing it, he was preparing the way for the miracle. He thought from his innermost self, if destiny brings me another battle, I'll be ready for it. For 40 years, he waited and waited, with an inarticulate hope. And then, in the end, at the hour of his death, fate brought him his battle. It came in the form of delirium, for as the Greeks knew, we are all shadows of a dream. In his final agony, he lived his battle over again, conducted himself as a man, and in heading the last charge, he was struck by a bullet in the middle of the chest. And so, in 1946, through the working out of a long, slow-burning passion, Pedro Damian died in the defeat at Massager, which took place between winter and spring in 1904. In the Summa Theologiae, it is denied that God can unmake the past, but nothing is said of the complicated concatenation of causes and effects, which is so vast and so intimate that perhaps it might prove impossible to annul a single remote fact, insignificant as it may seem, without invalidating the present. To modify the past is not to modify a single fact. It is to annul the consequences of that fact, which tend to be infinite. In other words, it involves the creation of two universal histories. In the first, let us say, Pedro Damian died in Entre Rios in 1946. In the second, at Massager in 1904. It is this second history that we are living now. But the suppression of the first was not immediate and produced the odd contradictions that I have related. It was in Colonel Dionisio Tabares that the different stages took place. At first he remembered that Damian acted as a coward. Next he forgot him entirely. Then he remembered Damian's fearless death. No less illuminating is the case of the foreman Abaroa. He had to die, as I understand it, because he held too many memories of Don Pedro Damian. As for myself, I do not think I am running a similar risk. I have guessed at and set down a process beyond man's understanding, a kind of exposure of reason. But there are certain circumstances that lessen the dangers of this privilege of mine. For the present, I am not sure of having always written the truth. I suspect that in my story there are a few false memories. It is my suspicion that Pedro Damian, if he ever existed, was not called Pedro Damian, and that I remember him by that name so as to believe someday that the whole story was suggested to me by Pierre Damiani's thesis. Something similar happens with the poem I mentioned in the first paragraph, which centers around the irrevocability of the past. A few years from now, I shall believe I made up a fantastic tale, and I will actually have recorded an event that was real. Just as some 2,000 years ago, in all innocence, Virgil believed he was setting down the birth of a man and foretold the birth of Christ. Poor Damian. Death carried him off at the age of 20 in a local battle of a sad and little-known war. But in the end, he got what he longed for in his heart. And he was a long time getting it. And perhaps there is no greater happiness. Commentary on the other death. All the theologians have denied God one miracle, that of undoing the past. The 11th century churchman Pier Damiano, however, grants him that all but imaginable power. This gave me the idea of writing a story about a scientist who, in some minor and unobtrusive way, attempts a similar feat. He hides 2 black balls in an upper drawer and 3 yellow ones in a lower drawer, and after years of hard work finds that they have changed places. I was not long in perceiving that this tame miracle would never do, and that I would have to dream up something more dramatic. I thought of a common man coming to such a wonder unawares at the very moment he dies. Aparicio Saravia's revolution had caught my imagination from boyhood, and I saw a way of combining, in a setting of that backwoods revolution, the gaucho idea of courage as the one cardinal virtue, and my metaphysical plan. And so my story, which was first titled The Redemption, was born. In the story, for literary purposes, the miracle takes place over a span of some 40-odd years. Pedro Damian's sin would be the more unbearable for him, since as the lone Argentine among Uruguayans, he would feel greater shame. Ultimately, Damian dies as he would have liked to die, struck down by a bullet in the chest while leading a charge. Had this actually happened, his fellow soldiers would hardly have remarked on such a detail. I introduced it into my story in order to make the whole atmosphere that much more visionary. Emerson's verses are mentioned at the outset for 2 main reasons. First, because I simply admire their beauty. Second, so as to send the reader, if he goes back to them, off the track, since they strongly express the idea that the past is unchangeable. A favorite trick of mine is to work into my fiction the names of real friends. In The Other Death we find Ulrike von Kuhlmann, Patricio Gannon, and Emir Rodriguez Monegal.